A black man sat quietly in first class, ticket in hand, doing nothing wrong. Moments later, a flight attendant tried to remove him, and by the time the plane landed, she no longer had a job. What happened at 30,000 feet that forced an entire airline to respond? And why are people calling this the Rosa Parks moment of the skies? Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. The cabin buzzed with the soft rustle of boarding passes and polite murmurs, the kind of gentle chaos that fills a first-class flight just before takeoff. From the outside, it was a picture of luxury. Warm lighting, leather seats, silver cutlery placed just so. But no one knew the turbulence that was about to unfold, not in the sky, but in the aisles. At Gate 36 of JFK International, everything had appeared routine. A Delta One flight to San Francisco, a fully booked manifest, and a seasoned flight crew ready to usher in the elite few who'd paid thousands for their short-lived escape above the clouds. Among those early boarders was a sharply dressed black man named Marcus L. Carter. He was in his early 40s, poised, quiet, and exuding a kind of ease that seemed to ripple around him. He wasn't just another traveler. The way he moved, with the kind of stillness that came from long battles fought in silence, hinted at a deeper story. But today, he wasn't expecting to be tested. As he entered the first-class cabin, Marcus barely noticed the stares. A man in a tailored blazer, 2 rows up, eyed him, then looked away. A woman clutched her Chanel tote a little tighter. A few didn't even look, but you could feel the pause, the subtle recalibration of assumptions. Marcus had learned to spot that moment when people reassessed who they thought he was based on what they saw. Seat 2, A, a window seat. He placed his leather briefcase in the overhead bin, sat down, and adjusted his cufflinks. His movements were precise, methodical, as though he was setting a tone for the flight itself. Calm, collected, invisible. But then the air shifted. It began with footsteps, not the light shuffle of a passing attendant or the bounce of a late passenger. These were deliberate, punctuated steps. Moments later, a voice pierced the quiet. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" The words were simple, but the tone wasn't. It was sharp, rehearsed, the kind of tone used when someone believes they already know the answer and are just asking to make a point. Standing before Marcus was a woman in her mid-30s. Her name tag read J. Simmons, and everything about her, from her upright posture to the forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, said she was used to being in charge, and even more used to not being challenged. Marcus didn't flinch. He handed over the boarding pass with the same deliberate grace he'd used to buckle his seatbelt. She glanced at it, then glanced again. Something flickered in her expression, a flash of disbelief, before she handed it back, her lips tightening. "This seat doesn't appear to be correct," she said, voice loud enough to catch the attention of the passengers around him. Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's my seat," he said evenly. 2A. That's what's printed. There was a beat of silence, the kind that feels too long, too stretched, before Simmons spoke again. this time louder. I'll need to double check. Please don't get comfortable. Passengers began shifting in their seats, not wanting to look, but watching anyway. Phones were subtly lifted. One tap, then another. Record, just in case. It wasn't just a confrontation. It was something else entirely. What followed would take only 3 minutes. But in those 3 minutes, something irreversible would happen. A choice would be made. A line would be crossed. And the woman standing in the aisle, who believed she was correcting an error, would instead seal her own fate. Because what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man sitting quietly in 2A wasn't just another first-class passenger. He was about to become a name people would remember. Not because of who he was, but because of what she assumed. And 3 minutes later, she'd no longer be wearing a name tag at all. This is the story of what happens when quiet dignity collides with loud bias, and what it means when the people we overlook become the very people holding the system accountable. This isn't just about a seat. It's about a moment, the kind that forces a reckoning at 30,000 feet. The moment Jay Simmons walked away with Marcus Carter's boarding pass, the balance of the cabin shifted. The subtle hum of settling passengers was now interrupted by murmurs, darting glances, and the quiet anticipation of confrontation. A storm was forming, not from turbulence, but from the misuse of power in a space where dignity was expected. Simmons returned moments later, but she didn't look apologetic. Her lips were tight. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her uniform, and her eyes refused to meet Marcus's. "Sir," she began, "I checked with our system. There appears to be a mistake. I'm going to have to ask you to move to the economy cabin." Her words were clipped, her tone final. Not a request. A command. Marcus looked up slowly, his calm presence unsettlingly steady. "No mistake," he said quietly. "This seat is mine. I paid for it. You've checked. You saw it. You know I'm right." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't back down. "You're holding up boarding," she said, now louder, her voice sharp enough to slice through the tension. "If you continue to resist, I'll have no choice but to call airport security." Across the aisle, a young woman gasped. Others turned their heads fully now, no longer pretending to ignore the exchange. One man pulled out his phone and hit record. Another whispered, "Did you hear what she just said to him?" Still, Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. "I'm not moving," he said simply. To Simmons, that was enough. Without a word, she turned on her heel and stormed back toward the galley, her steps brisk and fueled by a cocktail of frustration and wounded pride. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Marcus. Her face, normally the picture of polished professionalism, was now flushed with indignation. But behind her, the ripple effect had already begun. Passengers whispered, some shaking their heads in disbelief. One woman leaned over to her husband and muttered, "He's not doing anything wrong. Why is she treating him like a threat?" Another voice, this time from the back of the cabin, chimed in, "I don't think this is about a seat." And it wasn't. Simmons wasn't merely enforcing protocol. She was enforcing perception. A perception shaped not by fact, but by assumption. It wasn't about the boarding pass anymore. It was about the discomfort she felt when authority was challenged by someone she didn't expect to challenge it. In the galley, she fumed. Her hands trembled as she reached for the intercom, dialing the cabin supervisor. "This man," she hissed, is refusing to follow instructions. He's causing a disruption in first class and escalating the situation. But even as she said it, the lie sat bitter on her tongue. Marcus hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved, hadn't said anything inflammatory. The disruption wasn't him. It was her insistence that her word outweighed the evidence in his hand. Minutes later, the cabin supervisor arrived. A calm-faced man named Gerald Ruiz, who had served over 15 years in aviation and knew how to read the air. He approached with caution, a tablet in one hand, his tone patient. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "may I see your boarding pass again?" Without hesitation, Marcus handed it over. Gerald tapped through the manifest, cross-referencing seat assignments and boarding information. A long pause followed. Gerald's brow furrowed, then lifted in understanding. "This is your seat," he said, handing the ticket back. "Everything checks out. I apologize for the confusion." Jay Simmons stepped forward, clearly bristling. "But when I checked, it said—" "You checked wrong," Gerald cut in, gently but firmly. "Mr. Carter has the correct assignment. Let's move forward with boarding." For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Thick, heavy, and unresolved. Simmons stood frozen, her professional composure cracking. Her authority, unquestioned for so long, was now under scrutiny. Not by her superiors, by the very people she served. "I was just doing my job," she mumbled under her breath as she walked away, her voice devoid of conviction. But the damage was already done. Marcus returned to his book, the corners of his mouth still, his expression unreadable. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. Tired of having to prove what should never be questioned in the first place. Across the aisle, a woman spoke up. "You handled that with grace," she said quietly. "I don't think I could have stayed that calm." Marcus gave her a nod. "You learn to," he replied. When it's not the first time, in the galley, Simmons could feel the walls closing in. She poured coffee for passengers with trembling hands. Each polite smile from a traveler now felt like judgment. Her ears burned with whispers she couldn't quite make out, but knew were about her. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, how she had stood in front of Marcus, assuming without cause, certain she was right. And now she could feel it. She had crossed a line, and passengers weren't forgetting it. A man's voice rang out across first class, the same one who had been recording earlier. "Just so you know," he said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "this is going online." More phones came out. Not in protest, not in chaos, in quiet resistance. A collective understanding had taken root. What happened in that cabin was more than a mistake. It was a moment of bias, laid bare. And people weren't just watching. They were recording history. And somewhere behind the curtain, Jay Simmons began to realize the cabin might have moved on, but the story had just taken off. The cabin of Flight 382 from LAX to JFK was no longer a place of quiet relaxation or business class tranquility. It had turned into a living, breathing tension field, subtle but undeniable. Though boarding had resumed and passengers were now buckled into their seats, conversations whispered beneath the hum of the engines betrayed a cabin deeply unsettled. Some travelers tried to carry on with their books, their emails, their glasses of wine. Others couldn't stop glancing at Marcus Carter. He hadn't moved. He sat exactly where he was supposed to sit, seat 3A, first class, near the window, flipping through pages of a novel, his posture a fortress of calm. Yet around him, the energy was different. You could feel it. Some passengers leaned in toward one another with curious glances and hushed voices. Others stole looks at the galley curtain where flight attendant Jay Simmons had vanished not long ago, retreating into the quiet panic of consequence. Aren't they supposed to treat all first-class passengers the same? One woman murmured to her partner. I saw her face when she looked at him, another whispered across the aisle. That wasn't confusion. That was something else. Even those who weren't sure what to make of the confrontation felt something had gone wrong. And the passengers were dividing, not in anger, but in understanding. One group seemed determined to keep their heads down, unwilling to involve themselves, perhaps out of fear, discomfort, or complicity. Another group, growing by the minute, was watching Marcus not with suspicion, but with admiration. Admiration for how he had stayed calm, for how he had spoken with clarity and grace, for how, even after being wrongly accused, he hadn't lashed out. The flight continued its taxi onto the runway, but the emotional atmosphere had veered off course. In the back row of first class, an older white man, wearing a blazer and pocket square, leaned over to the woman beside him. You saw that, didn't you? He said. No one should be treated like that, especially when they've done nothing wrong. She nodded, folding her hands tightly in her lap. It makes you wonder how often it happens when no one is recording. In seat 2C, a young Latina mother shifted in her seat, her toddler sleeping against her shoulder. She glanced at Marcus with something like recognition. Not of him, specifically, but of the experience, of being questioned, challenged, dismissed. She hadn't said anything yet, but she would remember this flight long after it landed. Meanwhile, Jay Simmons remained in the galley, trying to regain composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the drink cart, her thoughts racing. She had always considered herself a professional, sharp, organized, and experienced. But today, something had snapped. Maybe it was the pressure of a long shift. Maybe it was something uglier she wasn't ready to name. She had made a judgment. And now that judgment had been challenged, not just by Marcus, but by the quiet fury of dozens of eyes watching her every move. Her colleague, Tara Fields, entered the galley and gave her a long, steady look. Tara was younger, newer, but not naive. She had been quiet through the incident, hoping it would resolve. But now, her silence weighed on her like lead. You okay? She asked, though the question hung awkwardly in the space between them. Jay Simmons didn't respond. She simply pressed her palm against the counter, steadying herself. They're turning on me, she said, her voice low. Maybe, Tara replied gently. Or maybe they're just seeing what really happened. Silence stretched, uncomfortable and sharp. Back in the cabin, the recording passenger, a tech consultant named Elliot Marsh, was typing furiously on his phone. The video was already uploading to social media, accompanied by a caption that read, "Black man wrongly confronted for sitting in his assigned first-class seat. Watch the way he handles it. Bias in the sky. Justice at 30K feet." Within minutes, the video had been shared dozens of times. Comments poured in, some furious, some heartbroken, some demanding answers. Elliot knew what he was doing. This wasn't just a moment. It was a message. And yet, Marcus Carter remained silent. He had seen the video uploaded, had even received a notification from a colleague who had recognized him. But he wasn't here for attention. He hadn't asked for it. He was simply trying to travel home. Still, when a middle-aged woman across the aisle leaned toward him and whispered, "Thank you for staying calm," he gave her a faint nod. No words, just acknowledgement. The captain's voice eventually broke through the atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude. Flight attendants will be coming through with refreshments shortly. Thank you for your patience." It sounded like any other flight, but the people on board knew better. This was no ordinary journey. Something had shifted, and not just because of one mistake, but because of the way it had been handled, the way it had been denied, and the way Marcus had chosen to respond. Simmons re-entered the cabin with the drink cart, her smile practiced but noticeably strained. The tension was still there, floating just beneath the surface. As she passed Marcus, she didn't say a word. She couldn't meet his eyes. The silence between them said everything. "Sparkling water, please," Marcus said quietly when she reached his row. She poured it quickly, placing it on his tray with a napkin. Still not looking at him. The woman in 2C watched the interaction and shook her head slowly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when a man in 4B asked Simmons, "Is it true you tried to have him removed?" her silence was louder than any answer. The cabin had divided, not into chaos, but into quiet sides of conscience. Some had turned inward, choosing the comfort of neutrality. Others had turned outward, realizing neutrality was no longer an option. And somewhere in that mid-air silence, Marcus Carter became more than just a passenger. He became a symbol of how injustice doesn't always come in loud bursts, but in subtle denials, quiet dismissals, and the calm resistance that refuses to go unnoticed. By the time Flight 382 touched down at JFK, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the tarmac. Inside the cabin, passengers remained seated, unbuckling only after the familiar chime. For most, it was just another flight. For Marcus Carter, it was something entirely different. And for Jay Simmons, the senior flight attendant who had wrongfully accused him, the descent wasn't just toward a runway, it was toward accountability. Marcus rose slowly from his seat, retrieving his carry-on from the overhead compartment. His movements were unhurried, composed. There was no need to rush. As he stepped into the aisle, a few passengers nodded to him, silent gestures of solidarity. One man clapped him gently on the shoulder. Another mouthed, "Thank you." Marcus responded with quiet grace, but he didn't linger. The moment wasn't about attention. It was about truth. At the front of the aircraft, just beyond the door, two airline representatives waited beside the captain. Their posture was formal, their expressions unreadable. Jay Simmons spotted them from the galley and froze. She instinctively adjusted her blazer, as though fixing her uniform could somehow erase the events that had unfolded. But nothing could undo the choices already made. "Ms. Simmons," one of the representatives said, stepping forward, "please remain on board. We need to speak with you privately before you disembark." Her heart dropped. The words, though polite, were unmistakable. She was being held back for review. Passengers began exiting row by row. The hum of rolling luggage and casual conversation filled the cabin, but within it was a subtle undercurrent, a tension still lingering. Simmons watched Marcus exit the plane, his back straight, his head high. He didn't glance back at her. In the terminal, Marcus was escorted by a different pair of airline officials into a private lounge. They were courteous, almost overly so, but he understood the performative nature of their gestures. Public relations damage control always began with courtesy. The lounge was quiet, the lighting soft. On the table sat a folder with his name on it. Jessica Lang, the airline's senior director of customer relations, entered moments later, followed by a corporate mediator and a legal advisor. Marcus stood as she approached. "Mr. Carter," she said, offering a hand, "I want to begin by sincerely apologizing for what happened on Flight 382. There is no excuse for the way you were treated." Marcus shook her hand, but said nothing at first. He waited for the usual script to play out. The explanations, the rehearsed regret, the promises of change. But Jessica didn't follow the script. "I know you've probably heard 100 apologies," she continued, her tone earnest. "And I know none of them can undo what happened. But we're not here just to say sorry. We're here to ask how we can do better." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. That was a different opening. "I'm listening," he said. Jessica sat down, folding her hands on the table. "We've reviewed the footage. We've spoken to the crew and several passengers. What happened wasn't a miscommunication. It was a failure of judgment, of training, and of accountability. And we believe your insight can help us confront those failures honestly." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You're asking me to consult on how to fix a system that dismissed me?" "I'm asking you to help us dismantle the part of the system that allowed it to happen," she replied. "We've created an internal task force to address bias in our customer service model, and we'd like you to join our Passenger Advocacy Council as a founding member." There was a pause, not because Marcus didn't have words, but because he understood the magnitude of the offer. This wasn't just about making things right for him. This was about changing how the airline treated people who looked like him, and those who didn't have the presence or calm to stand up for themselves. "I'm not interested in being your public relations mascot," he said plainly. "If I do this, it has to be real, transparent, not just corporate optics." Jessica nodded. "Agreed. Total transparency. We're also revising our training protocols, not just bias awareness, but actual situational scenarios where staff are required to confront their assumptions. And we want feedback from you." Marcus studied her face. She meant it, or at least believed she did. That was a start. "I'll join the council," he said, "on one condition." "Name it." "Every 6 months, I want a public report published, detailing the number of bias-related complaints, how they were resolved, and what steps were taken. No red tape, just the facts." Jessica hesitated for only a beat, then nodded. "You have my word." Outside the lounge, a different conversation was unfolding. Jay Simmons sat in a cold, windowless meeting room. Her badge had been removed. A human resources officer and a representative from the airline's ethics committee sat across from her, reviewing notes on a tablet. "Ms. Simmons," the HR officer began, "you've been placed on administrative suspension pending further review. However, due to the nature of the incident, we are required to inform you that termination is a likely outcome." Simmons swallowed hard. She wanted to defend herself, to say she had just been following protocol. But she knew better. Deep down, she remembered what had flickered in her mind the moment she saw Marcus. A silent judgment. One that had nothing to do with boarding passes or policies. She had acted on bias, and now that bias was staring back at her with consequences. Across the airport, Marcus stood at baggage claim, his phone buzzing with messages. Reporters, colleagues, friends, strangers. The video was already gaining traction. People were watching, but he ignored them for now. He picked up his suitcase, walked through the terminal, and stepped out into the cool evening air. He didn't feel vindicated, not yet, but he felt something else, momentum. The apology had come, but what mattered now was everything that would follow. 3 months had passed since the events aboard Flight 382, but the memory of that day still lived in the minds of those who were there. The video had ignited more than just social media commentary. It sparked a reckoning within Skylinks Airlines and rippled through the aviation industry. For Marcus Carter, life hadn't returned to normal. But then again, he hadn't wanted it to. He stood at the front of a conference room inside Skylinks headquarters, now serving as a founding advisor on the airline's newly established Passenger Advocacy Council. Around him sat a dozen diverse voices: business travelers, frequent flyers, disability rights advocates, and social justice leaders. People chosen not for their titles, but for their lived experiences. Their goal was simple: to ensure that no passenger would again be dismissed, profiled, or humiliated without consequence. Marcus cleared his throat and began reading a letter aloud. It was written by a passenger who had witnessed the incident on his flight. She was a young black woman who had stayed silent during the confrontation. In her message, she thanked him for standing his ground because she knew she wouldn't have had the courage to do the same. When Marcus finished reading, the room was quiet. But it wasn't the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of reflection, of a shared understanding. That letter wasn't just a thank you note. It was a reminder that dignity in travel shouldn't be a privilege. It should be a right. Since that fateful day, the airline had undergone significant change. Skylinks had introduced a revamped training initiative titled Altitude Matters, which focused not only on customer service, but on empathy, implicit bias, and de-escalation. Every cabin crew member, from regional shuttles to international routes, was required to complete the course annually. Passengers even noticed the difference. Flight attendants, who once seemed detached, now engaged more warmly, listened more actively. Jessica Lang, still leading Skylinks' customer relations division, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She had pushed for sweeping reforms, not just for Marcus, not for optics, but because she finally saw what had been hidden in plain sight. When she'd stood beside Marcus during press conferences and internal town halls, she didn't play the role of a corporate fixer. She played the role of a student learning in real time how culture was shaped by choices, not slogans. Meanwhile, Jay Simmons was no longer with the airline. Her departure had been quiet, absent of fanfare or legal battles. She had released a brief public statement acknowledging her actions, though many found it lacking the depth of a true reckoning. Still, her removal wasn't the story that mattered anymore. The focus had shifted from retribution to restoration, from pointing fingers to lifting voices. Marcus continued to fly. In fact, just last week, he boarded another Skylinks plane, this time heading to a leadership conference in Chicago. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, a young flight attendant greeted him by name. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. We're honored to have you with us." It wasn't the words that struck him. It was the sincerity in her voice. It was the absence of doubt in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, he sat down not with his guard up, but with a sense of peace. Change didn't happen because of a single confrontation at 30,000 feet. It happened because someone chose not to be silent, because passengers stood up, recorded, spoke out, because leaders inside the airline chose humility over defense, and because Marcus Carter, calm, composed, unwavering, refused to move from a seat he rightfully held. As the wheels of that next flight lifted off the runway, Marcus gazed out the window at the clouds. He didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a man who had claimed space not just in a seat, but in a system that had once denied him his full humanity. Real change doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like the hum of engines cruising through the sky, steady and forward moving. And this time, it came from 30,000 feet above, where dignity finally found a place to belong. In the story of Marcus Carter, we witnessed more than just a man being wrongly confronted on a plane. We saw a quiet storm of injustice unfold, and more importantly, how calm courage and unwavering dignity can turn that storm into a movement for change. From the moment Marcus was asked to give up his seat, not because of any mistake, but because of how he looked, the wheels of something much greater began to turn. He could have complied, silently moved to the back, or allowed the humiliation to pass unchallenged. But instead, he chose to stay, firm in his truth, measured in his response. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He simply stood his ground. And in doing so, he forced a system built on subtle, often unchecked biases to stop, look itself in the mirror, and begin the hard work of change. The journey that followed was not easy. The flight attendant who tried to assert authority without accountability faced consequences she never imagined. Her downfall was not Marcus's victory. It was the catalyst for a larger conversation. The passengers who spoke up, the one who recorded the incident, the voices that rallied online, each became part of a chorus demanding better. But what truly turned this from a moment into a movement was what happened after the flight. Marcus didn't fade away into the background. He stepped forward. He used his voice not to punish, but to push for progress. He joined forces with leaders at Skylinks Airlines to reimagine what dignity in air travel should look like. He helped build a passenger advocacy council. He asked for policy, not pity, action, not applause. And through it all, he remained true to the same calm resolve he showed on that plane, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful stand is taken not with volume, but with presence. So what can we learn from Marcus Carter? We learn that real power doesn't come from titles or uniforms. It comes from standing in your truth when it's uncomfortable. We learn that dignity is not something granted by systems. It's something each of us carries, and it must be protected even when others try to strip it away. We learn that change doesn't require anger to be effective. It requires conviction, community, and courage. In a world where injustice often hides behind politeness, Marcus's story teaches us to pay attention, to speak up, not just when it affects us, but when we see it affect others. Whether it's on a plane, in a boardroom, or in a classroom, the principle remains the same. Every person deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with respect. And when that doesn't happen, we don't walk away. We lean in, we question, and we choose to be part of the shift. So the next time you find yourself in a situation where silence feels like the easier option, remember Marcus. Remember how one calm refusal to back down rewrote the rules at 30,000 feet. Let his story remind you that integrity always flies higher. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes to something you hadn't seen before, we'd love for you to support our journey. Hit that subscribe button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and help us bring more powerful, true-to-life stories to light. Your support is what keeps stories like this alive, and we promise the next one will be just as unforgettable.